There we go. All right. So, today we're going to talk about tips and tricks for writing historical fiction. We're going to talk about the regular old historical fiction, things like Jennifer Ann Nielsen's kind of stuff. Yes, she did false print. A lot of historical fictions like Resistance and things like that. And I believe she even did one recently, like Words on Fire and things like that. They're very cool. If you feel like historical fiction is really boring, I'd recommend checking out her stuff. There are good historical fictions, and then there are okay historical fictions. This is talking about how to be the really good ones, the ones that people are like, you know what? Even though I already knew what was going to happen, because of the fact that it's historically based, I still felt interested and compelled. That's what we're looking for here. Because you want to tell a story that interests people and that makes people excited, even if they're like, well, it's World War II, so I already know what happened in World War II. You want to make sure that they're still interested. Or if you wrote it during the Salem witch trials, for instance, they'll be like, well, it's the Salem witch trials, but you haven't told your story yet, and that's the beauty of this. So we're going to be talking about every kind of historical fiction, even those that are technically historical fiction in quotation marks, like historical fiction, like historical fantasy, and steampunk, and various things like that. So first, choose what time period you're going to do. This is incredibly important because this is from where everything stems. Your character gets what your characters like gets decided by this. What your character's favorite food is gets decided by this. What your character acts like around certain people gets decided by this. Your setting, your clothing style, everything about your story it revolves around this. So if you're like, I want to write about a detective, well, that detective is going to look drastically different in different time periods. If you have a Western detective, that's going to look entirely different and have a lot of guns and shooting and fighting. Whereas if they're in the 1920s, it's probably going to look a little bit more hard-boiled, sitting in the chair, drinking whiskey and going, that hot dame over there, she's gorgeous. It's going to look drastically different, right? Because of the fact that the time period is what's going to make them who they are. Because time ultimately does define us. Honestly, even who we are today, what you're wearing today, how you feel today, what you've done today, even just waking up, is affected by the time period you were in. You probably, if you have a phone, looked at your phone today. If you lived in the 1920s, you would not have a phone. And that would drastically change your lifestyle. Whether call someone easily, whether or not you can get a hold of someone easily. That's why a lot of detective mysteries are set in the past, because then it makes it far more interesting, because it's like, I can't call, but they need to know so and so's a traitor. Whereas if they had a cell phone nowadays and they had decent reception, it'd just be like, sup, buddy, he's a traitor. Super easy, we solved it. um, so that time period is really going to affect. It also includes things if you want to write things in the future. If you're going futuristic, that is going to drastically affect everything. That's why in some of those sci-fis, you see people who have crazy looking outfits. It's not because the director of the movie or the writer of the book was just like, I want crazy looking outfits. It's because they're being realistic. Fashion style changes drastically. Let's be real here. How many of us have looked at past fashion styles and gone, why did they wear that? It's because of the fact that at the time it seemed fashionable. There are even people who talk about nowadays, like, here are 15 different makeup trends for ladies that don't match up today. Like, for example, in the Victorian era, high foreheads were incredibly popular, so much so to the point where people would pluck out their hairs just to make it look like they have a higher forehead, which now to us looks like receding, balding hairline. So make sure that you know the time period and know what people would actually do and look like. Speaking of which, moving into that category, after you pick said time period, make sure that you do your research because it is incredibly important that you do your research well. Without your research, everything else is going to fall apart. And yes, you can exaggerate things a little bit because obviously there are things out of the normal. There are lots of, Regency romance era things that are like, they had big poofy sleeves. And it's like, well, big poofy sleeves weren't really a thing back then. But maybe they specifically wanted to. And I could totally see that. Some random girl being like, I want to be so in style, I will make up my own style. Poofy sleeves. Or alternatively, like people do nowadays, 80s clothing. And everyone's like, but it's 2025. They're like, don't care, I like 80s clothing. like that too, where you harken back to previous eras where someone's like, you know what, I don't like these Regency dresses. I want to wear a Victorian style dress. Screw everything else. I don't. That's what I want to wear. So make sure you do your research, but realize that exceptions to the rules can happen. You've just got to explain why they're an exception to the rule. If you don't have the why, then you leave readers going, they don't really know that much about this era, and therefore those who are super historical buffs, which are most people reading historical, leave. Whereas if you give a reason for it, where you're like, well, they really, really like this, or it was their father's jacket, so even though it's really outdated, it was their father's, so they want to wear it. You know, that kind of gives them a reason to be wearing it instead of just saying, I want them to, because I'm the author. Which, even if that is the reason, don't let the reader know that's the reason. Make up your own new reason. All right, after doing your research about the clothing, the food, even the language, because let's be honest, reading Old English, oi. And the reason it's so rough is because language evolves and changes as we go on. That's why sometimes you even run into places in England that are like speaking English and you're going, what did they just say? And it's not because they're not speaking English, it's because they're speaking their own evolved version of English with such a thick accent that you're just going, what? And in some ways, you want a little bit of that for your historical fiction novel because it's realistic. You don't want so much of that your reader is staring at the page going, okay, do I need a translator? That's when it's been taken too far. So using some of the lingo is perfectly acceptable, but make sure they're not so embedded in the lingo that you completely and utterly are blinking in exasperation at your characters. Or alternatively, you as a writer are having to go, okay, so let me translate this and then write it down. If you're having to translate, the reader's not going to have any fun. Well, the real historical buffs might have. Average reader's going to go, I thought I knew everything about this time period, and I don't. And now I'm sad. All right. So then here's the next fun part. This is when you branch off. So you have historical fantasy, you have time travel, you have all sorts of things, etc., etc., etc. So the main problems that you're going to run into here are going to be what has changed, what makes the world different, and make sure that you really truly think about what would make the world different. For example, I'm not going to say which book, but if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. There is a particular historical fantasy that I just couldn't deal with. Part of the reason why is because the editor seriously overlooked something in the name of power of the story. And even though power of the story is important, you also need to look at his story itself. Even if it's historical fantasy, you're rewriting the universe using fantasy. So you need to take into idea what precautions that has. This, I believe, is something that Sanderson likes to refer to as the Sanderson's law of something, blah, blah, blah. Sanderson. Something Sanderson said. Basically, he said along the lines of, if you have people with fire magic and everyone has fire magic, why do you need candles? So you need to think the kind of that. So going back to the original example, this particular author had a universe where vampires had existed for thousands of years, and yet by the end of the story, her brother was the first black vampire. No, if they've existed for thousands of years, there would be at least one, maybe a dozen, maybe 3,000 probably black vampires. I'm sorry. They've probably bitten a black person before. They wouldn't be the first black vampire. I don't care what year it is. If they've existed for 1,000 years, there'd be at least one. They were going like, it's the Civil War. There's no black vampires. No. Never gonna happen. So, speaking of that, you gotta think of the repercussions of whatever you do for your fantasy. So if you're like, it's the 1920s and suddenly dragons. Take into account, what the heck would these dragons do? Are they violent dragons? Are they just cute little pet dragons that sit there and like warm your fire? Like, and then again, think about, would they even want a fire after that, or would they just have their cute little dragon that's all warm sit on them like a heated blanket? Like, like, do they even need those kinds of things? Would we have even invented heaters because you have little dragons wandering around? Got to think of the repercussions for whatever fantasy thing you're throwing into history. Really look at history and say, okay, these inventions exist because of X problem. If my fantasy thing solves X problem or creates X new problem, how do we deal with it? Next thing, time travel. Always a fun one to deal with in historical novels. However, the one problem you're going to run into is how to make them not look like they're nuts. If they time travel and they are not in historical garb, first of all, you got to think of the gender, because if you're going to Puritan England and you're a girl wearing short sleeves and a short skirt, you're probably going to get hanged as a witch. And even if you're a guy and you're wearing a t-shirt and long jeans, you're probably going to get hanged as a witch. So you're probably going to want to have your time travelers have some sort of access to historical clothing, and if they don't, they need to steal some without getting caught. Alternatively, they also need to learn how to speak a little bit more like them and address why they can speak like them, how they can speak like them. Because let's be real here. How many of you regularly speak Old English in your everyday life? Probably not. So why do your people know how to speak Old English? Why do they know so much about this time period? Why did they go back to this time period? What are they trying to change, if anything? How is that going to change the future? And then also, how do they not die because someone thinks they're insane, or get committed to an insane asylum because someone thinks they're insane, or alternatively change all of the future because they go, I'm a sorcerer. I predict the future because I read way too many history books. Look, Timmy's gonna fall down a well. Then you also might get hanged as witch if you were in Salem Witch Trial days. But if you were in ancient Greece, you'd probably be a very, very famous person, and everyone would love you. So, gotta take those things into account with your time travel historical fiction. Also, gotta take into account the classic. How are they not spreading new mutant viruses and murdering the whole planet? That's a good thing to take into account, unless you just straight up go poof magic, so no problems, which you can do, but if you do with a poof magic solution, you need to make sure that you explain to your readers it's the poof magic solution. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is steampunk. So, what's the deal with steampunk? Steampunk is both considered historical fiction and not. The reason why is because of the fact that the steampunk era was, in some ways, kind of short-lived. It wasn't a real era, it was an aspiration. It was something that everyone wanted to have happen. The Victorian era is what everyone wanted to be the steam era. And yes, there were steam engines, and yes, there were a lot of things that ran off steam power. But most steampunk novels go futuristic and say, what if we continued with steam power, never bothered with gasoline or any other kind of power, just steam power? That's when you get into more of the steampunk genre that is not historical fiction and is more just steampunk in general. This is more historical fantasy, where you're saying, what if steampunk era but better? So take into account kind of those various factors when you're writing your steampunk. Also, keep in mind that you may not know a lot about the Victorian era, and that would be important to research. Yes?
Could you, describe the steampunk genre? Because I'm a little lost.
That's okay. So, steampunk genre, best way to describe it. It's like if the Victorian era, where they had steam engines and everything, had gone to its fullest conclusion. If we had steam-powered toasters and steam-powered cars and steam-powered dragons and steam-powered fill-in-the-blank. Instead of inventing electricity and gasoline-based things, we continued with steam power. As a result, you're going to have a lot of metal, a lot of gears, a lot of people wearing Victorian era style clothing. That's why a lot of steampunk novels have people with, the dapper suits and the top hats and the gears on all of their top hats and everything, because that was a big thing back then, and it's kind of become more of a steampunk thing. You also are going to run into a lot of the big poofy Victorian era ball gowns and women wearing masks and all that kind of stuff. If you look up kind of steampunk era pictures, you'll come up with a lot of good clothing ideas. It's a really fun era for clothes. But as far as the inventions in the era itself, it mostly just focuses on the fact that your whole universe needs to be steam powered. Moving forward with that, even though steampunk is semi-considered historical because for a while we were steampunk. The world was steam-based. But then we moved out of that. So, you can also have anything punk. Pretty much, you put a thing that the world is based on and then put punk after that, and that is what it is. So you could have a solar punk universe, which unfortunately, sadly, never actually existed. So, no longer historical. That would be sci-fi. But, or alternative reality, if you want to go into that genre. You could do a solar punk universe where everything is powered by the sun. You could do a wind punk universe where everything is powered by wind. You could do a fire punk universe where everything is powered by fire. You could do a cyberpunk universe where everything is powered entirely by various computer networks. That's kind of the era that we're in now. Not quite, because we still have gasoline cars and stuff like that, but we're slowly moving towards electric cars and things like that, right? So we're moving kind of into a cyberpunk era. And at that point, it would become historical fiction. Weird to think about, but true. So anything that is what runs the universe is kind of going to be something other punk. Does that help answer your question? Okay. Yeah, steampunk is one of the unique ones because it's the only one that actually existed for a time. Everything else has been an amalgamation of different types of things helping run the universe, whereas that was the one time where there was just one universal thing kind of powering everything. All right, moving forward. With all this information, there's one thing you want to avoid, and I think most of you who have been here before know where I'm going with this. Avoid info dumping. Info dumping, for those of you who do not know or it's been a while since you've heard me say this, info dumping is where you just start literally just bleh, like a textbook out on the page. So instead of going like, oh, she had a gorgeous dress and everything, you're like, did you know that in 1975 this dress was invented to blah, 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 blah. Too long. Too much. We don't need to know that. She didn't know that. She probably doesn't care. She just thinks the dress is pretty. Move on. You can add information and introductory facts without making them info dumping. And the best way to do that is if the person is actually interested. So if the girl, for instance, who buys the dress is interested in fashion, you can totally do that. Where she's like, I've always wanted to be a fashion artist. Did you know that this person invented blah, 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 blah? Then it sounds much more interesting too because we're learning more about the character. We're not just getting information straight. If you can copy and paste your paragraph into a textbook somewhere and theoretically have it like pass and no one would even notice that it was your book instead of the textbook, you've got a problem. That's pretty much how to identify info dumping. If it could be put in a textbook, whether it's a fantasy textbook, a mythology textbook, a historical textbook, or fill in the blank other kind of textbook, it's probably info dumping. Or if it could be put into a textbook of your character's life, it is also info dumping. So, last thing I want to talk about today is creating characters. Because your character is ultimately the heart of the story, and that's why people read historical fiction. The reason why people read historical fiction is not because they love a certain era, although sometimes that's definitely part of it. I have a friend of mine who's so obsessed with Regency that literally her whole Instagram is just Regency. So yes, that could absolutely be a part of it, but part of it is also the characters. You love those characters in that time period for whatever reason. And these characters are what's going to compel your story forward. You could have a great fantasy concept, you could have a great historical concept, you could have a fantastic world, but ultimately your characters are going to be the driving factor in anything you write, but especially historical fiction. Because yes, people have seen this before. People know what the Civil War was like. People know what World War II was like. Even if they didn't live through it, they've read enough textbooks to know what happened. So your characters are going to be what really drives them, makes them feel like they're in the moment and in the story. You need to make sure that your characters are not only well based historically, but also that they can help guide you through this time period. So a great example of this is if you were to have a character who was a very stubborn, very classically like, I'm going to just go out and do whatever the heck I want during classic Puritan times. Well, that's a fantastically interesting character because you're going, okay, she's disrupting this social norm. And let's talk about why she's disrupting the social norm, because she probably had it beaten into her as a child that this is not normal. And so, why is she able to feel that she can do this? But also, beyond the why is it that her character feels that she still wants to do this in spite of all the risks? What makes her move forward? What makes her not afraid? What makes her interested? Or alternatively, if you have a character, for instance, that's 12 years old but wants to lie about their age and pretend they're 16 and join the army in World War I or something like that, because they didn't really have proof back then. They didn't care. They were like, if you say you're 16, you're 16. Get up. But what made them want to do that at 12 years old? Most 12-year-old kids are like, I'm going to go hang out in my backyard and eat popsicles. They aren't thinking, I'm going to go join the war. So what makes them want to join the war? Did their dad die? Did their brother go missing during a war? Do they want to go look for them? What compels us as a reader to say, this is an interesting story, let's keep reading? What makes them truly unique in this time period? And sometimes it can even just be as simple as seeing how big things affected the little people in them. And I do say little people not because they're small, but because the fact that they may not have gone and changed the world. They may not have gone and, stood in front of a tank and said, halt! But you could still be drastically affected by these events, right? I know that there was a biography I read once about the Japanese internment camps that America had for a long time. And she talked all about how horrible they were and what her life was like. And honestly, that was fascinating, not just because it was a real story, but because of the fact that I was like, I can't believe this happened. And I can't believe all these horrible things happened. How could history do that? I wanted to learn about what happened so that way I could try and prevent it somehow. Try and make sure that didn't happen again. Try and learn from her and be inspired by her life of difficulty and rising above that difficulty later in life. And so we don't just read these stories because they're fascinating. We also read them because they give us something. They help us learn a little bit more about ourselves. And even historical fantasy can do that too. How many people absolutely love Captain America? and it's technically historical fantasy, because does Captain America actually exist? No. But is it fun to think that, he existed and that he and Carter were so in love? And, the fact that they never got their deaths and everything, all that kind of stuff, it, makes it very interesting, right? And it makes it very much that we're like, we see this history, but we also see what could have been and interesting facts and how the world could have worked and various things that inspire us. All right, moving forward. That is semi the end of the lesson. Do any of you guys have questions about writing historical fiction or in general writing historical stuff? Because as we said, historical fantasy is also still technically historical fiction. It's just not classic historical fiction. Any questions? If not, I can also turn off the video. Yes.
So I'm writing a book where one of the characters, like, she goes back in time to all these different time periods. So she goes to like a lot of them, and she's kind of like immersing herself in all these different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be able to write it without constantly being like, and then she goes to this place, and then she goes to this place, and then she goes to this place. So how can I do that? How can I make her go to all these time periods without just totally jumping around?
Two options. One, you go the classic Magic Treehouse route and have one place per book. And just go to that one place and focus on that one place for that book. Or alternatively, if she has to jump timelines mid-book, you can also have it where there's a reason she has to jump mid-timelines. Like she's following this specific villain or something, and this specific villain has jumped timelines, therefore she has to. And so kind of have her being disassociated and being jarred by the fact that she's jumping all these timelines all the time and trying to get it straight and trying to have to focus on specific cultural norms and being dressed right and not disturbing the current timeline. That could definitely add an extra layer of complexity for sure. So I would say either have a reason or have individual books on it to help the reader follow it a little bit better. Does that help?
That helps a lot.
Cool, I'm glad. Any other questions regarding historical in general? Not particularly? Okay, cool. Then I'm going to turn off the video. Reminder again, the deadline has been extended for the Fantasy Spring Contest. It was originally the end of April. Now it is the end of May. So you have until the end of May to write that short fantasy story. If you are interested, you can ask me for a form because we will not be giving those forms out until March. Also, I will be sending those forms out with the emails, or at least I'll be trying to. Sometimes I forget to attach them, and if I do, just send me a friendly reminder, hey, you forgot to attach the thingy, and I'll send it to you. I'm going to turn the video off. Feel free to ask me any other questions you'd like after that, or just free write. You're also welcome to use any pens, pencils, like I said, the whiteboard, markers, anything you like. And I'm just going to turn the time over to kind of free writing time.